In a tight-knit farming community where everyone knows everyone, Sarah Mitchell never expected her morning shift at the local diner to end in unemployment. All she did was stand up to a cruel customer who was terrorizing a gentle German shepherd. But that single act of compassion cost her everything she'd worked for. What she didn't know was that the quiet farmer whose dog she defended would turn out to be her unexpected savior. As weeks turned into months, their friendship blossomed into something deeper, something neither of them saw coming. Now, 5 months later, Sarah faces another life-changing surprise. She's carrying his child. Sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when we choose to do what's right, no matter the cost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the slightly dusty windows of Miller's diner, casting long shadows across the worn checkerboard floor tiles. Sarah Mitchell had been here since 5 a.m., her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her blue uniform carrying the familiar scent of coffee and bacon that had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. "Order up for table 6!" Jerry's voice boomed from the kitchen, accompanied by the sizzle of hash browns on the grill. Sarah grabbed the plates with practiced ease, balancing them along her arm as she'd done thousands of times before. The regular customers had started trickling in. Mr. Peterson with his crossword puzzle, Mrs. Henderson and her endless stories about her grandchildren, and the morning crowd of factory workers who always ordered the same breakfast special. Between refilling coffee cups and jotting down orders, Sarah caught glimpses of her reflection in the chrome napkin dispensers. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed the late nights she'd spent calculating bills, trying to stretch her meager wages and tips to cover rent, utilities, and the medication her mother needed. But she never let her smile falter. That smile was worth its weight in tips, and she needed every penny. The familiar rumble of a pickup truck drew her attention to the window. James Cooper's old blue Ford rolled past, right on schedule. He was a creature of habit, that farmer, making his supply runs every Tuesday and Friday morning. His German shepherd Max always sat in the passenger seat, head held high like some kind of canine royalty. Sometimes they stopped in, and Max would get his own bowl of water and a few scraps of bacon that Sarah would sneak him when Jerry wasn't looking. "You know that dog eats better than half the county," Martha, the other waitress, often teased. But Sarah had seen the gentle way James treated his companion, the quiet understanding between man and dog. It was a welcome contrast to the usual chaos of the diner. The morning rush was starting to die down when Sarah noticed Max outside, his nose pressed against the diner's window. He wasn't supposed to be here alone. James's truck was nowhere in sight. The dog's tail wagged hopefully as Sarah caught his eye, and she couldn't help but smile. Max was the only regular customer who never complained about the coffee being too hot or the toast being too cold. Her attention was pulled away by the chiming bell above the door as new customers entered. She tucked her order pad into her apron, pocket, straightened her name tag, and turned to greet them with the same warm smile she'd perfected over 3 years of service. Just another day at Miller's Diner, where every face had a story, and every story was served with a side of small-town charm. Little did she know, this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but routine. The bell above the door chimed again, this time with more force, as a man in an expensive charcoal suit strode in, phone pressed to his ear. Everything about him screamed city, from his polished Oxford shoes to his precisely trimmed hair. Sarah could smell his designer cologne from across the diner, a sharp contrast to the homey scent of fresh coffee and morning bacon. "No, tell them the meeting can't wait," he barked into his phone, sliding into a booth without looking up. "I don't care about their schedule. I'm already stuck in this backwater town for the day." Sarah approached his table, order pad ready. "Good morning, welcome to Miller's. Can I start you with some coffee?" He held up a finger to silence her, continuing his phone conversation. Sarah stood patiently, used to such treatment from the occasional business travelers who found themselves at Miller's by chance rather than choice. Through the window, she could see Max still outside, now padding closer to the diner's entrance. The businessman finally ended his call. "Fine, coffee, black, and make it quick. Some of us have actual jobs to do." Sarah bit back a retort, years of customer service experience keeping her professional smile in place. As she turned to fetch his coffee, the diner's door swung open, and Max trotted in, his tail wagging as he recognized the familiar environment. The German shepherd's paws were muddy from the morning's rain, leaving slight tracks on the linoleum. Before Sarah could redirect him, he brushed past the businessman's table, a small smudge of mud transferring to the man's pristine suit pants. "What the?" The man exploded from his seat. "Get this filthy mutt away from me! This suit costs more than you make in a month." Max backed away, ears flattening against his head. The diner fell silent, all eyes turning to the commotion. "Look what it did to my pants." The man advanced toward Max, who cowered against the counter. "Someone should teach this beast a lesson." He raised his hand threateningly. Sarah moved without thinking. She stepped between Max and the businessman, coffee pot still in hand. "Don't you dare touch him." "Excuse me?" The man's face reddened. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are." Sarah's voice was steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. "You're someone who's about to threaten an innocent dog over a bit of mud that can be cleaned with a napkin and some club soda. I'll have your job for this insolence." He turned toward the counter, where Jerry had emerged from the kitchen. "Are you in charge here? Your waitress is completely out of line." Sarah felt her world tilting as Jerry approached, his face grave. She knew that look. It was the same one he'd worn when he'd had to let go of 3 staff members during the last economic downturn. The bell chimed once more, and James Cooper rushed in, slightly out of breath. "Max, there you are." He stopped short, taking in the scene before him, his dog pressed against Sarah's legs, the furious businessman, and the dense silence that had fallen over the diner. "Is this your dog?" the businessman demanded. James nodded, his usually quiet demeanor tense. "Yes, sir. I apologize if he caused any trouble. He's never wandered off like this before." "Well, your precious pet ruined my suit, and this waitress had the audacity to defend it." Jerry cleared his throat. "Sarah, can I see you in my office?" "Now." As Sarah followed Jerry to the back, she caught a glimpse of James's face, a mixture of concern, guilt, and something else she couldn't quite read. Max whined softly, trying to follow her, but James called him back. She knew, walking into that small office, that she had just sacrificed her livelihood for a dog. But watching that gentle German shepherd cower in fear, she knew she'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat. Some things were worth more than a paycheck, like being able to look at yourself in the mirror the next morning. What she didn't know was that this ending was actually just the beginning. Sarah's hands trembled as she folded her uniform and placed it in her locker for the last time. 3 years of service ended in less than 3 minutes. Jerry had been apologetic but firm. The businessman was a potential investor in a chain of diners, and his influence could make or break the struggling establishment. In the end, business was business. "You can use me as a reference," Jerry had offered weakly, unable to meet her eyes. "You're a good worker, Sarah. It's just—" "I know," she'd replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "You have to think about everyone else's jobs too." Now, gathering her belongings, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Her mother's medication wasn't covered by insurance. The small stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table seemed to grow taller in her mind. The back door creaked open, and Martha peeked in, her eyes red. "Some of us are putting together a little something," she started. But Sarah shook her head. "Please, don't. I'll be fine." Pride was sometimes all you had left, and Sarah clung to hers like a lifeline. Outside, the morning had turned grey, matching her mood. As she stepped into the alley behind the diner, a familiar bark caught her attention. Max stood there with James, who was leaning against his truck, clearly waiting for her. "Miss Mitchell," he began, pushing off from the truck. His work boots scuffed against the gravel as he approached. "I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am. If I had secured the gate properly, it's not your fault, Mr. Cooper." Sarah forced a smile. "Max is a good dog. He didn't deserve to be treated that way." Max whined softly, pressing against her leg as if he understood. His fur was still slightly damp from the morning rain, but Sarah didn't mind the moisture seeping into her jeans as she knelt to scratch behind his ears. "Still, you lost your job because of us." James ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she'd noticed him make when he was troubled. "Please, let me help. I have some work available at the farm. I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept." "Charity." Sarah straightened up, adjusting her purse strap on her shoulder. "I'll figure something out. I always do." "It's not charity." His voice was quiet but firm. "It's honest work, and I need the help. Max isn't the only one who's gotten older. Keeping up with everything alone isn't as easy as it used to be." A truck rumbled past the alley, and Sarah caught snippets of conversation from passers-by on the main street. Word would spread fast in a town this size. By sunset, everyone would know about the waitress who chose a dog over her job. Some would call her foolish, others brave. Right now she felt neither, just tired and scared. "I'll think about it," she finally said, though they both knew her options were limited. The closest town with any real job opportunities was 40 miles away, and her ancient Honda probably wouldn't survive the daily commute. James nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. It was slightly worn around the edges, as if he'd been holding on to it for a while. "The offer stands. And Sarah," he used her first name for the first time, his voice softening. "What you did in there, not many people would have done the same." She took the card, her fingers brushing against his momentarily. Max's tail thumped against the ground, creating little puffs of dust in the alley. As she walked to her car, Sarah could feel both their gazes following her. The quiet farmer and his loyal dog. The card in her hand felt heavy with possibility, but also with the weight of change. Everything familiar was slipping away, and the path ahead was terrifyingly unclear. Yet somehow, watching Max's reflection in her rearview mirror as she drove away, Sarah couldn't bring herself to regret a single moment of what had happened. Some choices defined who you were, even if they cost you everything you had. A week of unanswered job applications and sympathetic rejections had a way of wearing down even the strongest resolve. Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to make numbers add up in ways they stubbornly refused to. The business card James had given her lay beside her bills, its corners now softened from how many times she'd picked it up and put it down again. "Cooper Family Farm," it read in simple black text, followed by a phone number and address. She'd driven past the property countless times. Everyone in town knew the old Cooper place, with its weathered red barn and rolling pastures. What most people didn't know was how James had taken over after his parents' passing 5 years ago, turning the struggling farm into one of the most respected in the county. A knock at her door startled her from her calculations. Through the window, she spotted James's blue truck in her driveway, Max's familiar silhouette in the passenger seat. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the door. James stood there, holding a canvas bag that smelled suspiciously like fresh vegetables. "Thought you might be able to use some of the season's first harvest," he said, by way of greeting. "Mr. Cooper, I told you—" "James," he corrected gently, "and before you say anything about charity, these would have gone to the diner anyway. Seems only fair they should still find their way to you." Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Her small rental house wasn't much, but she kept it tidy. Max barked from the truck and James glanced back. "Mind if he joins us? He's been restless all week. I think he misses his favorite waitress." Minutes later, they sat at her kitchen table, Max contentedly sprawled at Sarah's feet. James looked out of place in her tiny kitchen, his broad shoulders and work-worn hands seeming too substantial for the delicate second-hand furniture. "The offer still stands," he said finally, watching as she arranged the vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, and early summer squash. "I could use the help, especially with the farmer's market season starting." Sarah traced the wood grain of her table with a finger. "I don't know the first thing about farming. You know how to work hard. I've watched you at the diner for years." He paused, then added softly, "And you know the difference between right and wrong. That's worth more than experience." A warm weight pressed against her leg as Max shifted, looking up at her with those soulful eyes that had started this whole situation. What exactly would the job entail? Help with the market stall twice a week, organizing orders, maybe learning to handle some of the vegetable gardens. He leaned forward slightly. "Pays fair, and there's a small apartment above the barn if you want it. Would save you rent money." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're offering me a place to live too?" "It needs some work," he admitted. "But it's yours, if you want it. Been meaning to fix it up anyway, just never had a reason to before." The proposition hung in the air between them, full of possibility and terrifying change. Sarah looked around her rented house, at the bills on the table, at the steadily diminishing opportunities in their small town. "I still don't want charity," she said finally. "Good," James replied, a hint of a smile touching his usually serious face. "Because I'm offering you a job. A hard one, with long hours and plenty of challenges, but also fresh air, good work, and—" he glanced down at Max. "A decent company." Sarah found herself smiling despite everything. "When do I start? Tomorrow morning? The farmer's market waits for no one." He stood brushing off his jeans. "I'll pick you up at 6. As she watched his truck pull away, Max's tail wagging goodbye. Through the window, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. Sometimes the best opportunities came disguised as disasters, and sometimes finding your path forward meant being brave enough to step off the familiar road entirely. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as Sarah stepped out of the barn apartment, breathing in the crisp morning air. After a week on the farm, her body was adjusting to the new rhythm. Muscles she didn't know she had ached from. Work she'd never imagined doing. But it was a satisfying kind of soreness. The apartment above the barn had surprised her. Though simple, it had charm. Exposed wooden beams, a small kitchen with a window overlooking the fields, and enough space for her modest belongings. James had clearly spent time preparing it, though he'd brushed off her thanks with a quiet, "It needed to be done anyway." Max's bark greeted her as she descended the stairs, his tail wagging enthusiastically. He'd appointed himself her unofficial guide, following her around the farm as she learned her new duties. The German shepherd seemed to take particular pride in showing her the best paths between the various buildings and fields. "Morning," James called from the garden, already knee-deep in work. "Thought we'd start you on transplanting today, if you're ready." Sarah joined him, noting how his usual reserved expression softened when he talked about his crops. He handled each plant with careful attention, explaining as he worked, "See how the soil needs to be just firm enough. Too loose, the roots won't. You'd take. Too packed, they can't breathe." She watched his hands demonstrate, calloused fingers gentle around a young tomato plant. There was something compelling about the way he worked. No movement wasted, every action purposeful. It was so different from the controlled chaos of the diner. "Your turn," he said, offering her a seedling. Sarah took it carefully, trying to mimic his movements. Her first attempt was clumsy, the plant listing to one side. "Sorry," she muttered, frustration coloring her cheeks. "No need to apologize." James knelt beside her, his hands covering hers to demonstrate the proper technique. "Like this. Feel the difference." His proximity sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. He smelled like earth and morning air, and something uniquely him. Sarah focused on the plant, hoping he couldn't hear her heart quickening. They worked. Through the morning, James teaching and Sarah learning. He explained the irrigation system, the importance of crop rotation, and his organic farming methods. She found herself fascinated by the complexity of it all, how every decision affected The next season, the next year. You make it look so easy, she commented during their water break, watching him expertly stake tomato plants. James shook his head, a rare smile touching his lips. Took years of mistakes to learn. Still learning, truth be told. Farms always. Got something new to teach you. Max appeared with a well-worn tennis ball, looking hopefully between them. Sarah threw it, watching him bound after it with pure joy. He seems happy to have company during the day. He's not the only one, James said quietly, then quickly added, "The farm, I mean, it's good to have help." They fell into a comfortable routine as the days passed. Sarah discovered she had a knack for organizing the market displays, her years of customer service transforming their booth into one of the most popular at the farmers' market. James started letting her handle more responsibilities, teaching her to drive the small tractor, trusting her judgment on which vegetables were ready for harvest. The physical work was demanding, but Sarah found herself sleeping better than she had in years. There was something deeply satisfying about ending each day with tangible results. Rows of planted seedlings, boxes of harvested vegetables, satisfied customers at the market. One evening, as the sun set behind the barn, Sarah caught James, watching her as she played with Max. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "You're good at this. Not everyone takes to farm life so naturally." The compliment warmed her more than it should. I have a good teacher," she said, then quickly turned her attention back to Max, trying to ignore the way James's eyes lingered on her. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment that night, Sarah realized something that both thrilled and terrified. This place, these people, they were starting to feel like home, and that feeling scared her more than any uncertainty ever had. The farmers' market buzzed with Saturday morning activity, and Sarah couldn't help but notice the sideways glances and whispered conversations as she arranged organic tomatoes at the Cooper farm stand. 2 weeks had passed since she'd started, working for James, and the town's rumor mill was working overtime. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Henderson's stage whisper carried clearly from the neighboring honey stand, living right there on his property in the barn apartment, and her, a single woman. Sarah pretended not to hear, focusing instead on creating the perfect display. The morning sun caught the deep red of the tomatoes, making them gleam like jewels. James had taught her how to arrange them just so, stem side down, to prevent bruising. "Sarah!" A familiar voice cut through the gossip. Martha, her former co-worker from the diner, approached the stand with a genuine smile. "I've been meaning to stop by. How are you doing, honey?" "I'm good, actually." Sarah straightened up, surprised to find she meant it. "Really good." Martha's eyes darted to where James was unloading crates from his truck, Max faithfully at his heels. "I can see why," she said with a knowing wink. "He's quite the catch, you know. Half the single women in town have tried to get his attention since his parents passed." "It's not like that," Sarah protested, though her cheeks warmed. "He's my employer, that's all." Martha's skepticism was clear. "Well, just so you know, most of us at the diner think you did the right thing that day. Jerry's been miserable since you left. Turns out good waitresses aren't as easy to replace as that businessman thought." Before Sarah could respond, a sleek car pulled up to the curb, and Emma Cooper stepped out. James's sister cut an impressive figure in her business casual attire, a stark contrast to Sarah's work jeans and Cooper Farm t-shirt. "James!" Emma called out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached. Sarah tensed, unsure what to expect. She'd heard about Emma, the successful real estate agent in the next town over, but they hadn't met yet. To Sarah's surprise, Emma stopped at their stand first. "So you're Sarah," she said, giving her an appraising look. "I've heard a lot about you, mostly from Max's Instagram account." "Max's Instagram?" Emma laughed. "My brilliant idea. Farming meets social media. We've gotten quite a following. And lately, there's been a certain blonde showing up in the background of his photos." James appeared beside them, looking mildly embarrassed. "Don't start." "What?" Can't I meet the woman who's got my brother actually answering his phone these days? Emma's eyes sparkled with mischief. Besides, I brought lunch. Sarah, you'll join us, won't you? Before either of them could protest, Emma had commandeered a corner of the market square for their impromptu picnic. Sarah found herself sitting on a checkered blanket between the Cooper siblings, sharing a spread of fancy sandwiches, while Max hoped for dropped crumbs. "You should have seen him as a teenager," Emma was saying, ignoring James's groans. "So serious about everything. Mom used to say he came out of the womb worried about the weather forecast." Sarah couldn't help but laugh at James's expression. "He hasn't changed much then." "Oh, I wouldn't say that." Emma's voice turned thoughtful. "He seems different lately, lighter somehow." The conversation drifted to farm business, and Sarah watched the siblings interact. Despite their different lifestyles, their affection for each other was clear. Emma clearly approved of the farm's recent success, especially their growing social media presence. "Your market photos are gaining traction," Emma noted, scrolling through her phone. "People love the authentic farm-to-table story. And Sarah, your arrangements are Instagram gold." Later, as they packed up the stand, Sarah overheard Emma talking quietly to James. "I like her little brother. Don't mess this up by being too cautious." It's not, please. I have eyes." Emma's voice was kind but firm. "Some things are worth taking a risk for." The drive back to the farm was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Max dozed in the back seat, tired from all the attention he'd received at the market. Sarah watched the familiar landscape roll by, thinking about Emma's words, about the town's gossip, about the way James's hands had brushed against hers as they'd packed up the vegetables. "Sorry about my sister," James finally said. "She can be intense." "I liked her," Sarah replied honestly. "She loves you a lot." James glanced at her, then back at the road. "Yeah, she does." He paused, then added softly, "She's usually a good judge of character." The compliment hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Sarah smiled and turned back to the window, watching their reflection in the glass. The quiet farmer, the ex-waitress, and the German shepherd who had brought them together, driving home under a warm summer sky. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, turning the afternoon sky an ominous shade of green. Sarah stood at the barn door, watching James secure the last of the equipment. The weather alert on her phone had warned of severe thunderstorms, possible tornado conditions. The air felt heavy, electric with anticipation. "We need to get the sensitive crops covered," James called out over the rising wind. "The tomatoes and young peppers won't survive hail." They worked quickly, efficiently, a rhythm developed over weeks of farming together. Max darted between them, sensing the urgency in their movements. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer with each boom. "The row covers are in the back shed," James directed, already moving that way. "We'll need all of them." A massive gust of wind cut him off, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as they raced to the shed. Inside, James quickly handed her several rolled-up row covers, their hands brushing in the dim light. The storm hit in earnest as they secured the last cover. Rain pounded against them, and lightning split the sky with brilliant forks. Max pressed against Sarah's legs, whining at each thunderclap. "We need to get inside," James had to shout to be heard over the storm. "The barn's closer than the house." They ran through the downpour, Sarah clutching Max's collar to guide him. The wind howled around them, driving the rain sideways. Just as they reached the barn, a deafening crack split the air. Sarah looked up in time to see a massive branch from the old oak tree break free, hurtling toward them. James moved without hesitation. He grabbed Sarah and Max, pulling them against him and back into the barn doorway. The branch crashed where they had been standing moments before. Sarah found herself pressed against James's chest, his arms around her, both of them breathing hard. Max huddled against their legs, trembling. "Are you okay?" James asked, his voice rough with concern. Sarah nodded, suddenly very aware of their proximity, of how his shirt clung to his shoulders, of the way his heart hammered against her palms. Thunder boomed again, and the barn's lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. In the Seju. Darkness. Neither of them moved to break apart immediately. "We should—" Sarah's voice trailed off as lightning illuminated the barn, catching the intensity in James's eyes as he looked down at her. "Check the emergency kit," he finished, slowly releasing her. "There should be flashlights and lanterns." They found the supplies, setting up battery-powered lanterns that cast a warm glow through the barn. The storm raged outside, but inside, time seemed to slow down. They sat on hay bales, Max between them, listening to the rain and thunder. "I've never seen a storm this bad," Sarah said softly, absently stroking Max's fur. "Happened once before, when I was a kid." James's voice was thoughtful in the lantern light. "Lost half the crop that year. Dad was devastated, but Mom just said, 'Sometimes nature reminds us we're not in control. You don't talk about them much.'" "Your parents," James was quiet for a moment. "It's easier not to, sometimes. They loved this place so much. When they died," he trailed off, then added, "Running it alone, it felt like trying to catch rain with a bucket full of holes." "You're not alone now," Sarah said before she could stop herself. The lantern light flickered across his face as he turned to look at her. Something shifted in the air between them, heavy with unspoken words. James reached out slowly, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. His hand lingered, warm against her skin. Max chose that moment to shake himself vigorously, spraying them both with water. They jumped apart, laughing, the tension broken but not forgotten. "He has perfect timing," Sarah said, wiping water from her face. "Always has." James smiled, but his eyes stayed on her, soft and wondering. They spent the next few hours talking, quietly, sharing stories and comfortable silences as the storm gradually spent itself. When the power finally came back on, neither mentioned moving from their spot. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most important moments happened in the pauses, between lightning strikes, in the quiet spaces between words. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, but something had changed in the air between Sarah and James. Simple moments, passing tools, working side by side in the fields, sharing lunch breaks, now carried a different weight. Every accidental touch sparked with possibility. Every shared glance held a question neither was ready to ask. Sarah found herself increasingly aware of James's presence. The way he ran his hand through his hair when thinking, how his shirt stretched across his shoulders as he worked, the rare but wonderful sound of his laugh. She caught him watching her too, his eyes quickly shifting away when she noticed. "You two are ridiculous," Emma declared during her next visit, watching them dance around each other at the farmer's market. "It's like watching a pair of middle schoolers at their first dance." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah muttered, rearranging the same bunch of carrots for the third time. "Sure you don't." Emma's knowing smile was infuriating. "Just like my brother doesn't light up every time you walk into a room." Max, seemingly aware of the tension, had taken to orchestrating situations that forced them together. He'd suddenly need both their attention at once, or would strategically place himself, so they had to reach around each other to get tools. For a dog, he showed a suspicious talent for matchmaking. One afternoon, Sarah was updating the farm's social media accounts, a task Emma had officially handed over to her, when she found herself lingering over a photo from that morning. James was kneeling in the garden, sunlight catching his profile as he examined a tomato plant. The picture captured something essential about him: the gentle way he handled the plants, the quiet concentration on his face. "That's a good one." His voice came from behind her, making her jump. She hadn't heard him approach the barn office. "I was just—" Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Emma says we need more personal content. Shows the human side of farming." James moved closer, looking at the screen over her shoulder. His presence was warm behind her, smelling of sunshine and earth. "You're good at this. The social media stuff. The whole farm's running better since—" He trailed off, but Sarah knew what he meant. Since she came, since she stayed, since the storm, since everything started changing. "James," she began, turning to face him, but the words stuck in her throat. He was close, too close, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. Max's bark shattered the moment. A delivery truck was pulling up the drive, and James stepped back, clearing his throat. "Yeah," Sarah agreed quickly. "I'll finish up here." These moments kept happening, little pockets of tension that built and built, but never quite broke. During inventory counts in the barn, their hands would brush reaching for the same clipboard. In the kitchen of the main house, they'd accidentally bump into each other while preparing lunch. Each time, the air would grow thick with possibility, only to be interrupted by a phone call, a delivery, a helpful but poorly timed dog. The town noticed too. Whispers followed them at the market, at the grocery store, at church. Most were kind, approving even. "They're good for each other," Sarah overheard Mrs. Henderson telling her friends. "He smiled more in the past month than in the last 5 years combined." But some comments carried barbs. "Awful convenient, isn't it?" She caught snippets of less charitable conversations. "Loses her job, lands right in his lap, playing house in that barn apartment." Sarah tried not to let it bother her, but the words stung. She'd worked hard to build a life on her own terms, to never need anyone's help. Now here she was, living on James's property, working at his farm, feeling things she had no business feeling for her employer. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah sat on the steps of her barn apartment, watching Max chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. James approached, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He offered her one and sat beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Just thinking about how much has changed. 3 months ago I was worried about coffee refills and customer complaints. Now I'm worried about crop yields and market prices. Do you regret it?" The question was casual, but Sarah heard the uncertainty beneath it. "No," she answered honestly, turning to look at him. "I don't regret any of it." Their eyes met and held. Max abandoned his firefly chase to sit at their feet, his tail thumping contentedly against the wooden step. In the distance, a whippoorwill called, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Neither of them moved away, and neither of them moved closer. They just sat together in the growing darkness, watching night fall over the farm that was becoming their shared home, both aware that something between them was shifting, changing, growing, like seeds beneath spring soil, just waiting for the right moment to break through to the light. The day had been unusually hot for early summer, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the fields. As evening approached, Sarah finished storing the last of the day's harvest in the cool room. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and a gentle breeze had finally picked up, carrying the sweet scent of ripening strawberries. She found James in the berry patch, checking the irrigation lines. Max lay nearby in a shady spot, panting contentedly. The dog's tail thumped against the ground as Sarah approached, alerting James to her presence. "Everything's stored," she reported, pushing damp hair back from her forehead. "The restaurant. Orders are ready for tomorrow's deliveries." James straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thanks, you didn't have to stay so late." "I wanted to." The words came out softer than she intended. Their eyes met in the fading light, and that familiar tension crackled between them. "Sarah," James took a step closer, then hesitated. "I've been thinking." "Dangerous habit," she teased, trying to lighten the moment even as her heart raced. He smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "Maybe, but I can't stop thinking about this." He gestured between them. "Us. Whatever's been happening." Sarah's breath caught. They'd been dancing around this conversation for weeks, neither willing to be the first to acknowledge the growing attraction between them. "James, she started, but he held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I know this is complicated. I'm your employer. You live on the property, and if I'm reading this wrong..." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd grown to love. but I think I'll regret it forever if I don't tell you how I feel." Max chose that moment to get up and move closer, settling himself right between them as if encouraging them to close the distance. A laugh bubbled up in Sarah's throat, breaking some of the tension. "Your dog's not very subtle," she said. "Never has been." James smiled down at Max, then looked back at her, his expression growing serious again. "Sarah, these past months, having you here, it's like the farm finally feels whole again, like I finally feel whole again." He took another step closer, and this time he didn't hesitate. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb gently brushing her skin. "But it's not just about the farm, it's you. Your strength, your kindness, the way you light up every room you enter." Sarah leaned into his touch, her heart thundering in her chest. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "What if this goes wrong? I can't lose another job, another home." "You won't," he promised. "No matter what happens, this is your home now. You've earned your place here not just with the work you do, but with who you are." The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting everything in a golden glow. A firefly danced past them, followed by another and another, nature putting on a show just for them. "James," Sarah whispered. "Yeah?" "Stop talking." She rose up on her tiptoes, threading her fingers through his hair, and kissed him. He responded immediately, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her closer. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened with months of pent-up longing. She tasted like summer, he thought, like sunshine and strawberries and everything good in the world. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Max barked happily, making them laugh. James rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to let her go completely. "Been wanting to do that for a while," he murmured. "Me too." Sarah smiled, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. "Since the storm, maybe even before." "Definitely before," James agreed, stealing another quick kiss. "I think I started falling for you the day you stood up to that businessman. Nobody had ever defended Max like that before." Max woofed softly at the mention of his name, tail wagging as he watched his two favorite people finally figure things out. The fireflies continued their dance around them, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill began its evening song. They stood there in the growing darkness, trading soft kisses and softer words, neither wanting the moment to end. The complicated questions about work, about living arrangements, about the future, could wait. Right now, in this perfect moment, with the sweet smell of berries in the air and stars beginning to twinkle overhead, everything was exactly as it should be. Life on the farm took on a different rhythm after that evening in the berry patch. The work remained the same. Crops still needed tending, orders still needed filling, and Max still needed his daily walks. But now there were stolen kisses between tasks, shared smiles across the farmer's market stall, and lingering touches during their daily routines. James started joining Sarah for morning coffee on her barn apartment steps, arriving just as the sun peeked over the horizon. They'd plan the day's work while watching dawn paint the sky, Max contentedly sprawled at their feet. Sometimes they'd talk about deeper things, their hopes, their fears, the paths that had led them to each other. "I never thought I'd find this," James admitted one morning, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "After my parents died, I was so focused on keeping the farm going, on not letting their legacy die, that I forgot about living my own life." Sarah squeezed his hand, and now he turned to look at her, his eyes soft. "Now I understand what Mom meant when she said the farm was more than just the land. It's about growing something meaningful, creating a life worth living." Their relationship became the talk of the town, but this time the gossip was mostly kind. The regulars from the diner would stop by their market stall, clearly delighted to see Sarah happy. Even Jerry, her former boss, commented on how well things had worked out. "Sometimes the wrong door closes so the right one can open," Martha told her wisely during one market day, watching as James helped a young child pick out the perfect pumpkin. Emma was ecstatic, though she tried to play it cool. "Finally," she exclaimed during her next visit. I was about to lock you two in the barn if something didn't happen soon. The farm's social media following grew as Sarah shared more personal content. Pictures of James working in the fields, candid. Moments with Max and behind-the-scenes glimpses of farm life resonated with their audience. People love a good love story, Emma noted, scrolling through the engagement metrics. One evening, after a long day of harvesting, they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset. Max had his head in Sarah's lap, and James had his arm around her shoulders. "Move in with me," he said suddenly. "Not in the barn apartment, here in the house. It's been too empty for too long." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "Are you sure? It's only been a few weeks." "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied. "But only if you want to, only if you're ready." She thought about the barn apartment, which had been her sanctuary during those first uncertain months. It had served its purpose, giving her independence and space to find her footing. But now, yes, she said simply, watching joy spread across his face. "But I'm keeping the apartment as my office. The farm's social media maven needs a proper workspace." They sealed the decision with a kiss, one that started gentle but quickly deepened. Max, sensing he was being ignored, nudged them with his nose until they laughed and included him in a group hug. That weekend, the whole community seemed to turn out to help Sarah move. Emma coordinated everything with military precision, directing traffic between the barn apartment and the main house. Martha brought lunch for everyone, and Mrs. Henderson arrived with a handmade quilt. "Every proper farmhouse needs one," she insisted. As Sarah hung her clothes next to James's in their shared closet that evening, she felt a profound sense of rightness. This wasn't just about moving in together, it was about building a life together, about taking all the broken pieces of their past and creating something beautiful and new. "Welcome home," James whispered that night, holding her close as they drifted off to sleep. Max was curled up in his bed nearby, his steady breathing a familiar comfort in the darkness. Sarah snuggled closer, breathing in the scent that was uniquely James, earth and sunshine and home. "I think I've been home since the day I defended your dog," she murmured back. Sometimes, she realized, love grew like the crops they tended, with patience, care, and faith in tomorrow's sunshine. And sometimes it bloomed in the most unexpected places, turning loss into blessing, endings into beginnings, and two separate lives into one shared journey. The first sign was so subtle that Sarah almost missed it. Standing in the farm's kitchen one morning, the usually enticing smell of coffee made her stomach turn. She brushed it off as a passing queasiness, but when Max bounded up to greet her, with his usual enthusiasm, his familiar doggy scent nearly sent her running to the bathroom. "You okay?" James asked, concern etching his features as she emerged, pale and shaky. "You've been tired lately? Maybe you should take it easy today." "I'm fine," she assured him, though something nagged at the back of her mind. Probably just a bug going around. But as the days passed, more signs appeared. The fatigue that dragged at her limbs during their morning harvests, the unexpected tears when a batch of tomato plants didn't survive a frost, the way her favorite jeans felt just a little tighter around the waist. It wasn't until she was updating the farm's financial records that reality hit her like a thunderbolt. She stared at the calendar, counting days, then counting them again. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone to check her period tracking app. "Oh," she whispered, the word barely a breath in the quiet barn office. Max, who had been dozing at her feet, lifted his head at her tone, his ears perking up. The drive to the pharmacy in the next town over, because everyone in their small town knew everyone else's business, felt surreal. Sarah found herself gripping the steering wheel too tightly, her mind racing with possibilities. She bought 3 different tests, ignoring the knowing look from the cashier, and drove home in a daze. Back in the barn apartment bathroom, she couldn't bring herself. And to do this in the main house, she followed the instructions with shaking hands. The 3 minutes of waiting felt like 3 years. Max whined outside the door, sensing her anxiety. When she finally looked at the tests, lined up neat and precise on the counter, each one showed the same clear result. Pregnant. Sarah sank down, onto the closed toilet lid, her hands pressed against her still flat stomach. A baby. Their baby. The thought was terrifying and wonderful all at once. She and James had talked about the future, about marriage and family, but always in the someday sense, not the right-now reality she faced. Max's worried bark outside the door startled her. What if James wasn't ready? What if this changed everything? They'd only been together for a few months, even if it felt like forever. The farm was just starting to truly prosper. Their lives were just settling into a comfortable rhythm. "Sarah," James's voice called from outside. "Max came to get me. Are you sick again?" Her heart jumped into her throat. I'm okay," she managed, quickly gathering up the tests and shoving them into her pocket. She opened the door to find both James and Max wearing matching concerned expressions. "You're white as a sheet," James said, reaching for her. "That's it. I'm calling Dr. Thompson." "No!" The word came out too sharp, making both man and dog flinch. I'm fine, really. She swallowed hard. "I need a little time to think about something." James studied her face, worry clear in his eyes. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She let him pull her into a hug, breathing in his familiar scent of earth and sunshine. His solid presence usually calmed her, but now her mind was racing with questions and fears and wild hopes. "I love you," she whispered into his shirt. His arms tightened around her. "I love you too. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the tests in her pocket, the warmth of his embrace, the gentle brush of Max's fur against her leg. In a few hours, she would find the courage to tell him. In a few hours, their world would change forever. But for now, she just held on tight, sending up a silent prayer that this unexpected blessing would bring them closer rather than tear them apart. After all, their entire relationship had started with one unexpected moment. Why should this chapter be any different? Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon in a fog, her mind racing with different ways to tell James. The pregnancy tests felt like they were burning a hole in her pocket. Max stayed unusually close to her side, as if sensing the magnitude of what was about to happen. As the sun began to set, she found herself drawn to the berry patch where they'd shared their first kiss. James was there, as if guided by the same memory, checking the irrigation lines just as he had been that evening months ago. "I thought I might find you here," he said, straightening up when he saw her. His expression was worried, but patient. "Ready to tell me what's been bothering you?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd practiced this moment a dozen times in her head, but now all her carefully prepared words deserted her. Instead, she pulled the tests from her pocket and held them out with trembling hands. James stepped closer, confusion crossing his features as he took them. She watched as understanding dawned in his eyes, saw the moment the reality hit him. His head snapped up to meet her gaze, mouth slightly open in shock. He whispered. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, neither of them moved. The evening breeze rustled through the berry bushes, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called. Max looked between them, tail low, sensing the tension. "Say something," Sarah pleaded when the silence stretched too long. "Even if you're upset, even if this isn't what you wanted." She never finished the sentence, because suddenly James was there, lifting her off her feet in a spinning hug that drew a startled laugh from her throat. When he set her down, she saw tears in his eyes matching her own. "Upset?" His voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah, this is..." He pressed his forehead to hers, one hand coming to rest gently on her stomach. "This is everything." Relief flooded through her, making her knees weak. "Really? Because I know it's so soon, and the farm, and we haven't even talked about marriage." "Hey," James cut her off gently, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Remember what I told you about Mom always saying the farm was about growing something meaningful?" About creating a life worth living? He smiled, soft and wondering. I think she'd say this is exactly what she meant. Sarah laughed through her tears, leaning into his embrace. Max, sensing the shift in mood, pressed against their legs, tail wagging. James knelt down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Hear that, boy? You're going to be a big brother. The German shepherd's tail wagged harder, and he stretched up to lick Sarah's hand. She dropped to her knees too, wrapping her arms around both James and Max, creating a little circle of joy in the growing twilight. I was so scared to tell you, she admitted. Why? James pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. Because everything's been so perfect. The farm is doing well, we're happy, and this changes everything. I didn't want to disrupt. Sarah, he interrupted, taking her face in his hands. Nothing could make me happier than building a family with you. Yes, it might not be the traditional order of things, but when has anything about us been traditional? He smiled. We started with defending a dog, moved in together after a few months, and now... His hand drifted back to her stomach, wonder in his touch. Now we're growing something even more precious than any crop. They stayed in the berry patch until the first stars appeared, talking about the future, making plans, sharing hopes and fears. Max remained faithfully by their side, occasionally offering a paw or a nuzzle when emotions ran high. We should probably call Emma, Sarah said eventually. She'll never forgive us if she's not the first to know. James laughed, helping her to her feet. She's going to be impossible, you know that, right? Between the baby shower planning and the social media announcements. I wouldn't have it any other way, Sarah smiled, leaning into him as they walked. Back to the house, Max trotting ahead of them. The night was clear and beautiful, full of promise. Above them the stars twinkled like scattered diamonds, bearing witness to this moment when their lives shifted once again, expanding to make room for the newest bloom in their growing love story. Emma's shriek of joy could probably be heard 3 counties over. She'd arrived at the farm within an hour of James's call, bursting through the door with tears already streaming down her face. I'm going to be an aunt. She hugged Sarah tightly, then pulled back with sudden concern. Oh, was that too hard? Should I not squeeze? I don't know the rules yet, but I'm going to learn them all, I promise. James watched from the doorway, grinning as his usually composed sister transformed into a bundle of excited energy. Max circled them all, feeding off the jubilant atmosphere. The first Cooper baby in 30 years, Emma marveled, finally settling onto the couch. Mum and Dad would have been over the moon. She reached for James's hand, squeezing it. They'd be so proud of you both. The warmth of that moment was a stark contrast to the phone call Sarah made later that evening to her own family. Her relationship with them had been strained since she'd chosen to stay in the small town after college instead of moving to the city as they'd wanted. The pregnancy news was met with terse congratulations and thinly veiled disapproval. They'll come around, James assured her afterward, holding her close as she wiped away tears. And if they don't, you have family here. You have us. Word spread through the town like wildfire, as it always did. But this time, the gossip carried joy instead of judgment. Martha organized an impromptu celebration at the diner, decorating their usual booth with balloons. Even Jerry seemed genuinely happy for them, offering free pie for the little farmer. You know what this means, Mrs. Henderson declared during their next farmer's market. We need to start planning the wedding before that baby bump shows in. The photos! Sarah and James exchanged glances, both fighting smiles. They hadn't announced their engagement yet. That had happened privately the night after discovering the pregnancy, with James proposing in their kitchen, Max as their only witness. The simple silver ring on Sarah's finger caught the morning light. Actually, Sarah began, watching the older woman's eyes widen with delight as she noticed the ring. We could use some advice about local venues. The resulting squeal of excitement drew a small crowd, and soon their market stall was surrounded by well-wishers and eager wedding planners. James squeezed Sarah's hand under the table as their neighbors debated the merits of various locations. The farm, he whispered in her ear. It should be at the farm. Sarah turned to him, seeing the certainty in his eyes. Really, everything important in our lives has happened here. Why not this too? That evening, they sat on their porch swing, Sarah's head on James's shoulder, Max dozing at their feet. The setting sun painted the farm in shades of gold, highlighting the berry patch where they'd first kissed, the barn apartment where Sarah had found her independence, the fields where their love had grown alongside the crops. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "For what? For giving me a family, a real one." She placed his hand on her stomach, though it was still too early to feel anything. "For making me feel like I belong somewhere." James kissed her temple, his voice rough with emotion. "You did that all on your own. The day you stood up for Max, you showed everyone exactly who you were. Someone who fights for what's right, who cares deeply, who makes the world better just by being in it." He smiled against her hair. "I just had the good sense to recognize it." Max lifted his head at the sound of his name, tail thumping against the porch boards. Sarah reached down to scratch his ears, remembering that day in the diner that had changed everything. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "our little one is going to have the best big brother ever." The German shepherd's tail wagged harder, as if he understood and accepted this new responsibility. Above them, the first stars began to appear, witnesses to this quiet moment of family unity, of belonging, of love that had grown from the most unexpected beginning into something beautiful and real. The farmhouse's spare room had always been used for storage, old furniture, boxes of James's parents' belongings, and seasonal items that had nowhere else to go. Now, standing in the doorway with paint swatches in hand, Sarah and James saw it differently, not as a repository of the past, but as a promise of the future. "I think the yellow," Sarah said, holding up a soft, buttery shade. "It'll catch the morning light beautifully." James wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "Yellow it is." He paused, then added softly, "Dad built this crib himself, you know. For me, then for Emma. Mom always said it should stay in the family." The wooden crib stood in the corner, recently retrieved from the attic. Its simple, sturdy design spoke of careful craftsmanship and love. Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth rails, imagining the generations of Cooper babies who had slept there. "It's perfect," she whispered, blinking back tears. These pregnancy hormones were making her emotional about everything lately. Max, who had appointed himself her constant guardian since the pregnancy news, pressed against her legs. His protective instincts had kicked into overdrive. He followed her everywhere, alerted James if she seemed tired, and had taken to sleeping right outside their bedroom door. "I think someone's eager to help with the nursery," James laughed, as Max carefully carried a small, stuffed animal from the hall to the room, placing it deliberately in the crib. The wedding plans were progressing too. Emma had taken charge of transforming the barn into a reception venue, while Martha coordinated with the local women to handle the catering. The ceremony would take place in the apple orchard, where the trees would be in full bloom. Small and intimate, Sarah had insisted when the guest list threatened to expand to include half the county. Just family and close friends. She was showing just slightly now, a gentle curve that only those who knew could detect. The morning sickness had finally subsided, replaced by an energy that surprised her. She threw herself into both wedding and baby preparations, determined to have everything ready before she grew too unwieldy to move easily. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, they found a collection of James's mother's journals. Inside were detailed records of the farm's seasons, interspersed with personal observations and family moments. "Look at this," Sarah called James over, pointing to an entry. James spent all day following his father around the farm, carrying his own tiny toolbox. "He's determined to fix everything, just like his daddy." She smiled up at him. "Like father, like son?" James's eyes were soft as he read over her shoulder. She wrote about everything. The good years and the bad, the droughts and the bumper. Oh, crops! He turned a page, then stopped. Oh, Sarah looked where his finger pointed. There, pressed between the pages, was a dried apple blossom. The entry beside it read, "Today, my son told me he'll never leave the farm. He said it's where his heart lives. One day, he'll understand that hearts can grow to include more than just the land. Love makes room for everything that matters." She was right, James said quietly, his hand finding Sarah's. About all of it. They worked steadily through the weeks, painting the nursery, refinishing furniture, planning the wedding. The farm's social media followers delighted in the occasional glimpses Sarah shared of their preparations, especially the photos of Max helping in his own way, carrying paintbrushes, inspecting the crib, modeling the tiny bow tie he would wear at the wedding. Each evening, they ended up on the porch swing, watching the sun set over their land. Sarah would rest her head on James's shoulder, their hands intertwined over their growing child, while Max kept guard at their feet. Sometimes they talked about their plans and dreams. Other times they just sat in comfortable silence, listening to the crickets begin their evening song. "Mom would have loved you," James said one such evening. "She always said the farm needed a heart to match its soul." Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding. The farm's soul was in its rich earth, its growing things, its legacy of hard work and perseverance, but its heart, that was in the love that filled it, in the family they were building, in the future they were creating together. The bell above Miller's diner chimed just as it had hundreds of times before, but this time Sarah entered not in a waitress uniform, but in a flowing summer dress that barely concealed her growing baby bump. James held the door for her, and Max trotted in behind them, his collar sporting a new bandana that read "Big Brother in Training." The diner had changed hands 2 weeks ago. Jerry had finally decided to retire, selling the place to his niece Kate, a culinary school graduate with dreams of modernizing the menu while keeping the hometown charm. She'd invited Sarah and James to be her first official customers before the grand reopening. "It feels strange being on this side of the counter," Sarah commented as they slid into what used to be her section. The checkerboard floor tiles were the same, though freshly polished, and the chrome napkin dispensers still caught the morning light. "Welcome to Miller's. Well, I guess it's Kate's diner now." Martha appeared with coffee for James and herbal tea for Sarah. She'd stayed on to help with the transition, and her familiar presence made the changes feel less dramatic. "Though I still can't get used to not seeing you in that blue uniform, honey." Kate emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine apron. "I'm so glad you came. It wouldn't feel right opening without having you here." She gestured to a framed photograph on the wall, a new edition that showed Sarah defending Max that fateful day. Someone had captured the moment perfectly. Sarah standing protectively in front of the German Shepherd, face determined, while James could be seen entering through the door in the background. "My uncle told me this story so many times," Kate explained, "about how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best things in life. I want our customers to know that kind of magic can happen anywhere, even in a small-town diner." Sarah felt tears welling up. These pregnancy hormones were relentless as she looked at the photo. "I never knew someone took a picture." "Mrs. Henderson," Martha explained with a grin, "said she had a feeling it was going to be a moment worth remembering." Max, recognizing himself in the photo, wagged his tail proudly. A few other early morning customers began trickling in, and each one stopped to greet Sarah and James, to pat Max, to exclaim over Sarah's growing bump. The diner filled with the warmth of community and the scent of fresh coffee. "Try this." Kate set a plate of blueberry pancakes in front of them. "New recipe, but made with berries from your farm. Thought that would be fitting." The pancakes were perfect, light, fluffy, and studded with the sweet tart berries they'd harvested just yesterday. As they ate, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since that morning when she'd lost her job. The fear and uncertainty of that day had transformed into something beautiful, something she could never have predicted. Penny 4. Your thoughts? James asked, reaching across the table to wipe a bit of syrup from her chin. Just thinking about how life works out, she replied, watching as Max charmed a piece of bacon from Martha. If you'd told me then that losing my job would lead to all this. She gestured to her ring, her bump, their intertwined hands. Sometimes the best things in life come from standing up for what's right, Kate said, refilling their drinks. That's what Uncle Jerry always said about that day. He regretted letting you go, you know. It worked out for the best, Sarah smiled, leaning into James's side. Everything led us exactly where we needed to be. As they finished their breakfast, more. Regulars filled the diner. The morning sun streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, catching the silver of Sarah's ring, and the grey starting to show around Max's muzzle. Outside, the town was waking up, and their farm waited for them, ready for another day of growth. And harvest, ready to head home? James asked, helping Sarah to her feet. Home. The word held so much more meaning now than it ever had before. It meant the farm with its fertile fields and gentle rhythms. It meant their house with its newly painted nursery and James's mother's crib. It meant Max with his constant love and protection. It meant the life they'd built together, all because of one moment of courage in this very diner. Yes, Sarah said, taking his hand. Let's go home. The apple orchard bloomed right on schedule, turning the farm into a wonderland of pink and white blossoms. Emma had outdone herself with the wedding preparations, transforming the barn into an enchanted space with twinkling lights and flowing fabrics, while keeping the rustic charm that made it uniquely theirs. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, one hand resting on her now visible baby bump, watching the final preparations below. Her wedding dress, specially designed to accommodate. Her changing body hung ready on the closet door. In less than 24 hours, she would walk down an aisle strewn with apple blossoms to marry the man who had changed her life in every possible way. Everything's set, Emma announced, breezing into the room with an armful of flowers. The caterers are confirmed, the minister's ready, and Max's bow tie is properly fitted. She paused, noticing Sarah's contemplative expression. Having second thoughts? Not even for a second, Sarah smiled, turning from the window. Just thinking about how much has changed in a year. This time last spring I was worried about coffee refills and tip money. And now you're about to become Mrs. Cooper, mother-to-be, and social media queen of Cooper Family Farm. Emma set down the flowers and hugged her future sister-in-law. I've never seen James so happy. You know that, right? Max scratched at the door, and Emma let him in. He'd been anxious all day, dividing his time between Sarah and James, as if wanting to make sure both of his humans were okay. The German shepherd immediately went to Sarah, pressing his nose gently against her stomach, a new habit he'd developed since her pregnancy started showing. The best guard dog a baby could ask for, Emma smiled, watching their interaction. Did James tell you? He's already designing a special area in the garden where the baby can play safely while you both work. Complete with a shaded rest area for Max, of course. Sarah's heart swelled. James had thrown himself into preparations for both the wedding and the baby with equal enthusiasm. The nursery was ready, painted in soft yellow with white curtains that danced in the spring breeze. The old Cooper family crib held pride of place, refinished and gleaming, while a comfortable rocking chair waited by the window, a gift from Martha and the diner staff. The farm itself was thriving. Their social media presence had grown exponentially, with followers falling in love with their story and their sustainable farming practices. Orders for their produce had increased so much that they'd hired 2 part-time helpers, local teenagers, eager to learn about organic farming. "Oh!" Sarah exclaimed suddenly, pressing a hand to her side. "Someone's excited about tomorrow too." Emma's eyes widened. "The baby's kicking? Can I feel?" Sarah guided her hand to the spot, laughing at her. Future sister-in-law's delighted gasp when the baby kicked again. Max's ears perked up at the sound, and he watched the proceedings with keen interest. "That's your niece or nephew saying hello," Sarah said, enjoying the moment of connection. Have you and James decided if you want to know the gender before birth? Sarah shook her head. We want it to be a surprise, though James is convinced it's a girl. He says the farm needs more female energy to balance things out. The sound of a truck pulling up drew them to the window. James was helping the florist unload the last of the wedding flowers, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hair ruffled by the spring breeze. As if sensing their gaze, he looked up and waved, his smile visible even from a distance. You know, Emma said softly, Mom always said the farm was meant for more than just growing crops. She said it needed laughter, love, and little feet running around to make it complete. She squeezed Sarah's hand. I think she'd be so happy to see her dream coming true. As the sun began to set on their last evening before the wedding, Sarah took a walk through the orchard with Max. The apple blossoms released their sweet fragrance in the cooling air, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold, and, pink tomorrow, she would walk this same path toward her future. She would marry James under these blossoming trees, surrounded by the people who had become her family, in the place that had become her home. Their child would grow up here, learning about the cycles of nature, the value of hard work, and the power of love to transform lives. Sarah paused at the spot where the ceremony would take place, Max sitting faithfully beside her. Above them, the apple blossoms swayed gently in the evening breeze, nature's own wedding decorations. She placed both hands on her growing belly, feeling the gentle movements of their child. What do you think, Max? She asked softly. Ready for tomorrow? The German shepherd's tail wagged, and he leaned against her legs in his characteristic gesture of support. Together, they watched the sun set on her last evening as Sarah Mitchell, looking forward to all the tomorrows that awaited them as a family. 1 year later, the early morning sun painted long shadows across the farmhouse kitchen as Sarah gently rocked 6-month-old Grace in her arms. Through the window, she could see James in the garden, already at work with the summer harvest. Max lay in his usual spot near the baby's playpen, his graying muzzle resting on his paws, but his eyes alert, ever watchful of his youngest family member. Ready for your morning walk, sweet girl? Sarah cooed to her daughter, whose blue eyes, just like her father's, sparkled with delight. Grace had been born in the depths of winter, bringing warmth and light to the coldest season. Her arrival had transformed their lives just as completely as that long-ago morning at the diner, but in an entirely different way. The farm had flourished over the past year. Their social media following had exploded after Sarah started sharing their farm family journey, with Grace becoming as much of a star as Max. The sight of the baby sleeping in her carrier while Sarah worked at the farmer's market, or James giving tractor rides with Grace securely strapped to his chest, seemed to resonate with people far beyond their small town. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the morning air. Grace babbled happily, reaching out toward Max as he fell into step beside them. Their morning walks had become a cherished routine, a quiet time for just the four of them before the day properly began. Look who's up early, James called out, jogging over to meet them. He was already dirt-smudged and sweaty, but his face lit up at the sight of his girls. Grace squealed with delight as he kissed her chubby cheeks, then gave Sarah a proper good-morning kiss. Someone wanted to see her daddy. Sarah smiled, passing their daughter to James. And I think she's already developing your farmer's internal clock. They walked together through the apple orchard where they'd been married, now heavy with summer growth. Max trotted ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure his family was following. The morning dew sparkled on the grass, and somewhere nearby, a meadowlark trilled its morning song. Hard to believe it's been a year since we got married. Under these trees, James mused, adjusting Grace on his hip. Feels like yesterday and forever ago all at once. Sarah knew exactly what he meant. So much had changed, yet the core of their life remained the same. The rhythm of the farm, the loyalty of Max, the love that had grown from the most unexpected beginning. They reached the berry patch, now expanded and thriving. Sarah ran her fingers over the familiar plants, remembering their first kiss, the moment she'd told James about the pregnancy, all the milestone moments that had happened in this spot. "Mrs. Henderson says Grace is the spitting image of your mother," Sarah said, watching as their daughter grabbed at a nearby leaf with curious fingers. "She showed me an old photo yesterday at the market." James nodded, his eyes soft. "Mom would have adored her. Dad, too." He bounced Grace gently, making her giggle. "Though I think she's got your spirit, already trying to help with the vegetables." "Just like her mama," Max barked softly, drawing their attention to where the sun had fully risen over the fields, casting everything in golden light. The farm was waking up. They could hear the distant rumble of the delivery truck bringing their produce to local restaurants, including Kate's Diner, now one of their biggest customers. "Ready to start the day?" James asked, but Sarah held up a hand, pulling out her phone. One quick photo first, for the farm's followers. They posed together in the morning light, James holding Grace, Sarah leaning into his side, Max sitting proudly at their feet. The photo would later be posted with the caption, "From one brave choice to defend a dog, to a family built on love and faith in tomorrow." Sometimes the best things in life grow from the most unexpected seeds. As they walked back to the house, Sarah thought about that morning in the diner, about the scared waitress who'd risked everything to do what was right. She thought about James, who'd offered her a job but given her a future, about Max, whose gentle soul had brought them together, about Grace, their unexpected blessing who made their family complete. The farm stretched out around them, rich with summer growth and promise. There would be more harvests, more seasons, more moments of joy and challenge, but they would face them together, their love as deeply rooted as the ancient apple trees and as endless as the fertile fields that surrounded them. Max ran ahead to the house, then turned to wait for them, his tail wagging in the morning light. Sarah squeezed James's free hand, and together they walked toward home, toward their future, toward all the beautiful possibilities that lay ahead.